Now?
No, when?
Yeah, like 4 days a week, I guess. 3 or 4 days a week, depending on the week. Kind of had to be after a while. Like, not the very beginning, but then, like, there's too many meetings in person, too much lost by not being there. It's hard to explain.
No, it's not.
Are we ready to...
Yeah, I was just going to wait for Michael, but we can start. Hello, everyone. We're going to move into the event shortly, but I just want to take a moment to frame the significance of this event and future ones Columbia LP is planning on hosting this semester, specifically an entire series on antitrust and markets. It's a really big deal to have Matt Stoller and Tim Wu here, well, because Matt Stoller and Tim Wu are a really big deal. They're part of a wing of thinkers which has seized the initiative in Washington, and that intellectual wing is in full flight. Even in just the last few weeks, Lena Khan at the FTC declared war on non-competes, and Jonathan Cantor at DOJ moved for an aggressive breakup of Google's ad business. This administration is in a full-scale blitz. Framed in this way, it might seem like the arc of history is finally bending towards free and open markets. It might seem like we're winning. Reform might even seem inevitable. But it's not. We can't live in delusion. In one branch, for one moment, the anti-monopoly side has stolen the mandate of heaven. But we already know that the monopolies are coming to steal it back. The bitter truth is that there's nothing inevitable about the moment we're in. In Cupertino and in Mountain View, in Roslyn and in Seattle, they're plotting how they're going to get Khan and Cantor out. They're thinking deeply about how to keep Congress in gridlock and how to keep the courts packed. If the monopolists weren't paying attention before, they're certainly paying attention now. In the next administration, it's going to be much harder to get leaders into critical positions. For now, all we have is an opening. So we students need to fill that space. We need to make it tissue and mass. We need to move many of you into the courts and into Congress. We need you to take state AG races and keep the presidency. The job isn't finished, it's barely begun. And that's why this event is so important. We need to listen to Tim and Matt, and then we need a plan, because I'm looking at the next generation of antitrust. It's here in this room, and all of us need to wear that responsibility with dignity, discipline, and determination. With that, I'd like to recognize Professor Tim Wu for his introduction to Matt Stoller.
Yeah. All right. Good start. Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Wu, professor here at Columbia. I have the honor of introducing Matt, and I'm just incredibly happy that Matt's here to has come up to Columbia from D.C. Throughout American history, they have been recurrent figures, a pattern of figures who are courageous, entrepreneurial, often at personal sacrifice, but are the people who move history by initiating big ideas and taking on dangerous power sources. And Matt Stoller is one of those people. I couldn't say enough about how much he's affected the debate in D.C., in this country, and internationally. Some people, Matt's been compared to Upton Sinclair as a sort of similar figure. Recently, I've been reading, I'm going to go further back, reading a biography of Samuel Adams. And, you know, that's the sort of original anti-monopoly movement. And there's, you know, similarities in that time, all these times, and ours, when power becomes too great, too unaccountable. There are some people who are courageous enough to stand up, and Matt is one of those, and stand up early and before other people, and not take the safer route of waiting for other people to be there on the front line and then receive and carry forth their ideas. So Matt, I think, has really done a tremendous work in this area. Let me say a bit about more what he does. He's written a terrific book, Goliath, which I recommend to everyone here. He is currently the research director at the American Economic Liberties Project, which is an important nonprofit in D.C., which primarily focuses on anti-monopoly and economic liberty questions. He's also the author of a newsletter, Big, which everyone in D.C. reads. Certainly I read it when I was in the White House. And it when it came out, I think every week would have this sort of ripple effect, continues to have this ripple effect. But when I was in government, in the White House would, you know, it would happen and would have this influence. So I am very happy you're here. You also were a House staffer, Senate staffer for Bernie Sanders. And I'm looking forward to what you have to say.
That's a very kind introduction, and I have always tried to let my slightly broken emotional makeup work for me and work for the public. And so I think for everyone, the key to being a good anti-monopolist is to be slightly emotionally broken, but not let it overtake you. I'm just, that's a joke, just an FYI. Just break up monopolies. All right. So I'm here to talk about antitrust, but or at least that's what you were told. But what I'm going to talk about a concept that I coined a couple of years ago. It's been given many names over time. It's but what I call it is counterfeit capitalism, which is sort of the system of business that's kind of, it's not really business, that is, I think, increasingly dominant in our society and what we're up against as anti-monopolists. So this is a sort of an overgeneralization, but if I were to say what is the problem with America today, I would say that the problem is that most of our elite institutions are dedicated to cheating people. Pretty simple explanation. And to kind of start and give maybe a better way of framing it, I will ask a question, which is, why did our elites fall for Sam Bankman-Fried? Why did they fall for crypto? And Sam Bankman-Fried is not the first sort of T-shirt wearing weirdo who was beloved by Wall Street. Just a couple of years ago, it was that guy. Who you guys know who that is, right? That's it's Adam Neumann, the CEO or former CEO of WeWork, which was just a work sharing company, and then SoftBank gave him $10 billion, something like that, and then all of a sudden it became a tech company. So I'm going to read from WeWork's S1 when they were trying to go public, just to give you a sense of what he was trying to, the sort of culture. So to evidence their commitment to charitable causes and to ensure this commitment is meaningful, if Adam and Rebecca have not contributed at least $1 billion to charitable causes as of the 10-year anniversary of the closing date of this offering, holders of all of the company's high vote stock will only be entitled to 10 votes per share instead of 20 votes per share. So this is in 2019 when WeWork is trying to go public, and that was their pledge to investors. It was sort of this weird combination of altruism and greed. I think my favorite story about Adam Neumann is that he fired people for expensing meals when they were eating meat. And then he was later caught or seen eating meat himself. Now, the reason I bring it up is because that's not unusual in business. I mean, the sort of, the flamboyance of it is, Sam Bankman-Fried and Adam Neumann wearing T-shirts. But, if you look around, what you'll find is that this kind of behavior is routine, actually. So the chairman of Mylan, you remember the EpiPen scandal, right? When all of a sudden people were like, oh my gosh, why does this cost so much in the US? So the chairman of Mylan was profiled in the New York Times saying, my response to regulators, and he held out middle fingers. That was his response. That's not uncommon. The middle finger is not an uncommon choice. The guy who founded Live Nation, he was profiled in the New York Times, and apparently he has stationery with himself giving the middle finger, right? This is a common thing in business, and sometimes people are not as tacky, but that kind of anti-public spirit is not unusual. You see it with Blackstone, which is considered extremely sort of prestigious. You saw it with too big to fail banks in the crisis. You sort of see it everywhere. And so we have to deal with the fact that sociopaths are in charge of many of these important political and economic institutions. And then you have to ask the question of why. It's not like Adam Neumann worked hard from the bottom of WeWork and made his way up from the mailroom. He was put there. Why do we allow and foster cheating as a society? Not people in this room. I didn't do it. And the answer to that is counterfeit capitalism. Another way to put it is Gresham's law. You know Gresham's law? It's the idea that when you start counterfeiting money, bad money drives out good, because you can just produce as much counterfeit money as possible, as you want. Eventually, people will hoard good money, and counterfeit money will eventually take everything over. When we got rid of anti-monopoly laws in the late 70s and early 80s, we facilitated a form of capitalism which is based on cheating, and which is fundamentally based on taking a series of inputs that have a value and combining them into something that has less value than those series of inputs. So it's net destructive. That's what WeWork was. You want to take a very basic legal framework, take predatory pricing, which is pricing below cost in order to gain market power. So you're pricing below cost, which is to say you're taking a series of inputs and you're turning them into something that is worth less than the inputs themselves. And that is fundamentally destructive behavior, but what it also does is it privileges access to capital over operational competence. It's something that Amazon did for a long time, underpricing. It's something that Mitt Romney did with Staples, underpricing to kill competition, and then you raise prices later on. It used to be illegal in the early, I guess prior to 1975, and then the Supreme, these things sort of take time, but in the 1980s and 90s it became harder and harder to bring predatory pricing cases. And what happens when you privilege access to capital, being closer to Wall Street, over operational competence is you promote branding over operations. You promote, and this was parallel with the shift in finance. You promote fraud over actual honest business. And in finance, we moved from dividends to stock buybacks. We moved from financing operations mostly via equity, corporate operations, to financing it via debt. And this was an attack not just on labor, not just on the consumer, but on capital as well. So we have a lot of capital light business models. There was a New York Times story on a franchise the other day, the little gym. Franchising has become a place where private equity loves to go into because it's a capital light business model. It's what you see a lot of the offshoring. It's because in the US, we don't do capital heavy business models. Now, this is a shift that's relatively recent. It's a shift that took place over the last 30, 40 years. We have Professor Richard John is in the audience. He's helped teach me a lot. He's an amazing anti-monopoly scholar of the 19th, 20th century. And one of the things I've learned from him is that this shift is unusual. We've never seen anything like it in American history. People like to talk about cycles. Sometimes capital is, plutocrats win, sometimes the people win. But this is a very weird moment. We've never seen a moment post-1977, the idea that the state itself cannot operate as we do today. And so that's our task, to restore that. Now, one of the things I say in Goliath is, which I think is a little bit difficult to hear for a lot of progressives, older progressives, so I think you guys are younger, so it's easier for you to understand, is that the shift that took place in the 70s and 80s and 90s is one that largely escaped the counterculture left. It's one they didn't see. Because it was, in many ways, a fight within business. And that's not something that they were necessarily paying that close attention to. It was a fight between industrial powers and financial powers in the 1980s. And so to a lot of them, they saw just rich people fighting. So today, and this is very surprising to me, because 10 years ago, this room would not have had kind of anyone in it. But you guys are here now, and the resurrection of interest in antitrust, anti-monopoly, political economy, the legal tools that structured this system, which again is a different system than the one that we had prior to the early 1980s. I go back and forth between late 1970s and early 80s because it just sort of depends on how mad I am at Jimmy Carter. It's kind of like, I haven't had that much coffee, so I go back and forth today. So the resurrection of interest in anti-monopoly rules, which is basically antitrust, but also public governance over utilities. There's a lot of new important work going on there as well. I think reflects a maturity and an increasing understanding on the part of people who care about social justice and people who care about a just society. That there's something I think that we have to remember about justice in America, which is I think that something it took me a very long time to understand is justice is not just an abstract concept. And in America, how we do business is actually how we do justice. It's not being pro or anti-business. It's a method of doing business. And so that's why I think people are interested in antitrust, which is often seems to be rich people fighting rich people, but it's not. At the core of it is a question of, are we going to live in a society where our interactions with one another are based on fairness and are based on an equitable balance of power or not? And I think we know we're not there right now. And it's very surprising to be optimistic. I am optimistic, but we are in a pretty vulnerable spot, and we do need you guys as the cavalry. So anyway, I'd like to kind of open it up to more of a conversation between you guys and me and Tim, and just really excited that you guys are here and that you're interested.
Hey Matt, can I start by asking you you a question? If that's all right? Yeah. So first of all, thanks for those remarks. I didn't advertise I was going to, but this is something I'm very curious about your methods. You write this newsletter, Big, which is very widely read, and I would say one of the functions it provides is very important, which is something of an Upton Sinclair-like function, which is even going beyond investigative journalists, many of whom do a good job, and going way beyond the day-to-day kind of journalists. You get really deep into the guts of industries and try to figure out what's going on. And, that is hard. I think that's one of the reasons your stuff was so read in the White House, is that, people be like, what is going on here? And it's very hard to get that. So I just wonder if that is something you self-consciously decided to do in your work. I assume it is. And then also just how you go about getting into the guts of an industry in a way that is so hard, even for journalists to do.
Yeah, so I, is this on?
Yeah, I think
okay. So I actually don't need, oh wait, I do need this for the video, right? Yeah, okay. So it is intentional. I try to write with hope in mind. And the idea is to, I believe that anything that man has constructed in terms of our legal apparatus and corporate apparatus can be unmade or remade. And I think a lot of the reporting and advocacy presumes that it can't be. We have this notion of inevitabilism, right? That the technology is just advances, and globalization. There are these giant forces that shape the world we're in, which is just total nonsense. Like the choices that policymakers make all the time structure what we as people do. I mean, Richard's mentor, Alfred Chandler, in his last book, Alfred Chandler, great historian, he mentioned how antitrust enforcers, it's on the electronic century, so the development of television and computing and modern telecommunication, and he called the antitrust enforcers the gods of creation, because it was their choices which led to the structuring of these industries. And so what I try to do when I write is I try to look at a problem, a social problem, and then say, this is downstream from a policy choice that somebody made, and a policy choice that someone can unmake or can remake. And that, I think, is a different way of writing than a lot of people put forward. They just sort of assume a lot of, oh, well, consolidation is like a natural trend, right? Because, on the eighth day, God ordained lax antitrust enforcement or something. Thanks.
Can I go ahead? Do you mind if I go ahead with another kind of question? And then, sorry, I don't want to use, but we have some time. Another thing, these are just questions I've always wanted to ask you, but never had a chance to ask you in front of a large group. One of the things you've been willing to do in your career is essentially say things that will make people dislike you, which in Washington is, and in Washington there are sort of ways that you can be critical of things that are very, in a sense, inoffensive. Like everyone's allowed to say Congress is broken, but you're not allowed to say like this individual person. Or you can always say the other party is the problem. But I mean, there's sort of accepted channels of criticism in D.C. I would say you break those channels. I would say you sometimes criticize allies. You earlier criticized Carter, which is like, in Jimmy Carter, and so suddenly.
Everyone
Democrats,
here, I know how much you love Jimmy Carter.
People like
I'm
Jimmy
so
Carter,
sorry.
and you're willing to do it. And I think it takes an extraordinary courage. I think that every society and every time has its sacred cows who because of whatever, or their sacred policies or whatever, that no one's willing to take on. And I'd like, maybe it's hard for you to reflect on, but well, first I want to commend you for that level of courage, and ask you whether represented a conscious choice or was just what you felt needed to be said, or any reflection on that strategy.
So I'm a little brother, and I always like to annoy my older brother. And that's where I learned the skill, I think, of just being heard. One of the things I think happened at the beginning of my career, I'm been in politics for about 20 years, is the Democrats are like, they're pretty awful, right? Just in terms of like working in democratic politics. I don't know how many have done that, or working in a lot of policy operations. In the mid to early 2000s, when I sort of started learning about politics, I was kind of right after 9/11, and people would say, if you didn't believe what the most hawkish people believed, then you were a fifth columnist, right? There was a sense of a real kind of like McCarthyite sense. And then over time, you'd walk into Democratic Hill offices in 2006, and Fox News would be playing, right, on the TV. And then you'd be like, why are you playing Fox News? And they didn't believe that Fox News was biased for conservatives. They just thought it was news. I'm not kidding. This was like, we had to fight in 2008 to get the Democrats to not host one of their presidential primaries on Fox News. This was the Congressional Black Caucus and Fox News had a deal, and we had to force the candidates to drop out. There was this just meanness, like a real meanness within the Democratic Party. And when I worked in Congress in 2009 and 10, and I never liked Obama. I always thought that guy's no good. He surrounds himself with neoliberals. And when I worked for a congressman as a Democrat in Orlando during the financial crisis, everybody was getting foreclosed on. And I was trying to help people, right? And I didn't really have any power. But, it was so sad, people getting foreclosed on that would call, because the people that contact their member of Congress who are getting foreclosed on are not just your run-of-the-mill person that's getting foreclosed on. This is somebody that, like, feel a little empowered, and they also feel like they're being wronged. And so dealing with people who'd say, I gave all of my here's my paperwork, I'm doing everything right, why is the bank foreclosing on me? And I had to tell them, like, I can't do anything for you. You're just gonna, you're doing everything right, the bank is just gonna screw you and no one's gonna help you. And then he talked to people in the White House, and they would just sort of be like, those fucking deadbeats aren't paying their mortgages, right? And it was really horrible. And that level of, that disjunction was, I talked to my friends in Democratic politics who were like cheering Obamacare, and it was just so weird. It was so profoundly weird to be listening to people who are going through this cruelty, and to know that an entire generation was going to, my childhood, it was the children of divorce. I think for the children at that time, there was the children foreclosure. And I was just, it was hard to deal with. And so right before the war in Iraq, I was a supporter of the war in Iraq. and the reason is because I went to Harvard and I did all the fancy things and life was fair, or so I thought. And a bunch of men in suits, I was like, oh, is an invasion the right idea? I'll ask the men in suits. So I went to Harvard Institute of Politics and I read Tom Friedman and New York Times, and John Kerry, they all said, yes, an invasion is the right thing. And then it turns out that I'd endorsed mass murder. And I was like, well, that seems like a bad thing. And it took me a few years. I was really depressed. This is why I didn't like Obama, because I never trusted the men in suits after that. I was just like, all of them can lie and do lie. And so during the financial crisis, and when I saw what was happening, I was not willing to do that again. And I think a lot of people are really scared to say the emperor has no clothes. But sometimes the emperor doesn't have clothes, and we happen to live in a moment when there's just a lot of emperors without clothes, you know.
Well, he's not wearing a suit. I will.
No,
note.
it's true. The new guy's running We Work Hard. But anyway, I don't know if that helps, but it's like and there are lots of sacred cows, and I could go into some of them, but it is important to recognize that these sacred cows are designed to constrain what you can do around political economy. And like, I'm not somebody who's always out there spouting every unvarnished truth that comes into my head. You have to pick your battles, right? But it is important to recognize that the political system and the policy space works by binding what you can say and what you can do with all of these informal norms. And you guys know this. You are at Columbia Law School, right? You are bound by these norms. So it's really important to figure out ways to break out of them. And you're lucky because you have people that you can do it with. But these are really I don't know. I don't know if I answered your question. It's just kind of like these were searing experiences, I think, for to see.
No, I appreciate it. Was it's a tough. I'll if I can share one anecdote, if you don't mind. It was once we were at a conference at the University of Chicago with Jean Tirole, who's this famous Nobel Prize winning economist, and everybody was kind of afraid of him, in awe. He was a lunch speaker. He gave sort of a thing, and he kind of, at least superficially, was talking about how you need to enforce the antitrust laws more vigorously. So that seemed generally appealing. And then in the question time, I asked him, I was like, I see you're like, but what about remedies? And the antitrust law has turned its back on breakups, and it seemed to me like sometimes breakup make a lot of sense. There's like, it at least seems understudied as an economist. I don't know. I said something like that. It was a fairly polite question. And he said something incredibly dissatisfying, particularly for an economist where they spend so much time like empirically studying all this, but are willing to hand wave away. It's like, well, you can't do the breakup remedies because those don't work well or something like this. It's like some random kind of, those don't work well, like based on what? Because I just said that. Not much, maybe like a metaphor, like you can't unscramble an egg. I don't think he said that. And then there was another question. And then you got up and were like, answer that. You just like took over the whole room and we're like, why aren't you answering that question? What is it for you? How can you professionally get up there? And it kind of, I think that was a big moment and sort of, frankly, for my own, for myself, and then also for a lot of people in the room, which was like, why aren't we talking about remedies? Like, why do we accept remedies being breakup, structural remedies? Like, why did we let this become a taboo topic? And, you can't even propose it and just accept the idea. You just say, well, those don't really work or something, as if anyway. I personally appreciate that moment a lot.
It's a funny moment because your question was more aggressive than you let it seem. It was about the break. He talked about Google. He's like, well, of course you can't break it up, but we need to tweak around the edges. And you got up and you were like, why not break up Google? And he sort of wouldn't answer, but you were polite. And then I came in and I was like, you really didn't answer that. And I only learned years later that everybody was shocked and offended that I had said that, which was really weird because it wasn't rude. It was just that he has a Nobel Prize. And apparently what I learned is that having a Nobel Prize in economics means you can say whatever you want. People have to accept it as truth.
Yeah.
Which I honestly didn't know that.
I think it was Facebook, by the way.
Oh, it was Facebook?
Which is an even stronger case, right? Like why? Because, they just bought Instagram, bought these companies. They're easy to, even for an economist, they can see it's doable. But whatever. So that was that. Do you mind? What maybe one? Is that all right? One more question.
We're just going to reminisce for
yeah.
We're just good. That's just what we're going to.
Well, let me ask a question. Maybe praised you for your candor, and this is a risky question for me. As many of you know, I was just in the Biden administration, just came out. I'm curious what you think we've done, the Biden administration, we did right, maybe some stuff we did wrong, and any else you want to say about the next 2 years.
Well, I think the antitrust stuff is great, and I think everything you worked on is awesome. And it's funny. I didn't intend that as a joke. I'm like, literally, it's like if I don't, you're like some of the few people I don't actively hate, which is like a high compliment. No, I mean, there's a lot of things that you've done, I think, that were really helpful. The hearing aid, hearing aids got more competition in that market, so there's going to be, there is now a lot more. It's a lot cheaper to get a hearing aid. But there's a ton of interesting stuff going on in the anti-monopoly and the antitrust shops, and that the Pentagon's doing some fascinating things. I think there are a lot of things that the Biden administration has done wrong. What I would say, and I think first of all, like forcing me to be like, I like the Biden administration is very irritating, because I feel like a normie Democrat now, which I haven't been for a long time. So you've turned me into like a generic partisan. But I would say a couple of things. I think the trade agenda is really like incoherent. Yeah. They're negotiating all of these weird deals without any vision of what they're trying to accomplish. Big tech is going to take advantage of that. A lot of monopolists are taking advantage of that. It's all behind closed doors. It's very problematic, and that's the Gina Raimondo at Commerce, the big problem. I think Buttigieg's been a bad DOT. He's just been terrible on a number of policy areas, but mostly because he doesn't seem to care about the policy or running the department, which is really frustrating because he's a very talented guy. But if I were to pick one thing that like a broad structural critique, it would be, so one of the Biden is much better than Obama, because Obama was actively doing all sorts of really bad things. He was consolidating wealth and power, and it was because they had bad ideas. It wasn't, this is basically, Goliath isn't about Obama, but it's essentially, I wrote it because I had the question, like, why did my party, why did all of us choose to foreclose on so many people? Why did we push wealth and power upward in response to a crisis caused by the consolidation of wealth and power? And so I wrote a history because I figured, the history in our minds was bad. And Biden has done a lot of good things, and he's trying to decentralize power in some ways. But I think the big problem is the industrial policy push, which is really a major part of the Biden administration, is premised on private asset management. And that is a really bad way, just politically, it is a really bad way to deploy core infrastructure over the next 10, 20, 50 years. And we're going to see a lot of pain because of that. Yeah. So you don't want to have, I wrote a piece in my newsletter called like, keep McKinsey away from the infrastructure rollout. Mm-hmm. McKinsey being a metaphor, it's not just a metaphor, it's also a consulting company. You guys have heard of it. You probably get job offers from McKinsey, I'm sure. But it was a metaphor for, the Beltway bandits and kind of deploying capital through plutocrats and monopolists, or through public mechanisms. And I think Biden has sort of moved a lot of that, is moving a lot of that money through, through concentrated channels, and that's going to be a big problem.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I just if I can get into that debate. So, as many of you may know, the Biden administration had twin both competition and competitiveness agendas, and the competitiveness is more often described as industrial policy, which meant spend a lot of money to build industries that we want the United States to be strong in. And I actually worked with that group. I didn't work in that group, and there was always a sense there was a possible real tension between the antitrust and the building of our own businesses. I think if they were here, or even if the president were here, they would say that what they have in common is an effort to rebalance power, and that I think the president's basic instinct coming into power, coming into the White House, was that things had gotten out of whack. That, as you already said, the economic situation had grown to favor the wealthy on both coasts, tend to favor a non-productive business models like private equity, where you rearrange things and find new tax ways of new tax, or work people harder or fire people or something like that. Like non-productive industries taking way too much value. And some of the ideas behind the industrial policy were to, move money into the center of the country, move money away from China, and there's another idea. Many of the industries of the future being overseas, and try and employ a lot of people in other parts of the country. So I think those are the ideas. Maybe I'm curious whether it's the ideas you disagree with, or you're worried more about the execution.
Their intent seems right to me, but
Yeah.
if you're going to do a clean energy infrastructure, right, the way we deployed electric utilities in the 30s and 40s is very different than the way we're deploying renewables today.
Mm-hmm.
So, if there's having Brookfield Asset Management own a lot of our renewable infrastructure, I think is a problem, because and it's not that I am opposed to private asset management in principle. It's just that the way that these funds are structured really incentivizes a kind of disinvestment and financialization, rate increases and stuff. So you're kind of like, we're seeing with like heat pumps, right? We're doing a study on heat pumps. There was a bunch of money in the Inflation Reduction Act for heat pumps, and like a lot of the HVAC companies are now owned by private equity, and a lot of the money, heat pump prices have gone up pretty dramatically since the IRA was passed. So, and you're seeing buybacks there are more share buybacks than there are than the amount of money that the government is putting in the heat pump industry. So there's kind of like, it's like a leaky boat, and trying to bail out water out of a leaky boat instead of just plugging the hole, I think that's kind of the metaphor I would draw.
And I share many of your concerns. If I can speak on the CHIPS Act, the CHIPS Act, as many of you know, is a over $50 billion effort to try to reboot U.S. semiconductors industry, and it has some very attractive features. It is trying to employ people. They want to move it to. It's physically going to be located. Many of the facilities in Arizona, places like that, and it's a rebuilding of U.S. manufacturing capability at top levels. On the other hand, there was a time I was sitting with people running it, and I was like, "Are you just going to take a huge amount of money and give it to Intel, and give money to companies that are already profitable? Is that what we're going to end up doing?" And sort of fortifying monopolies, and that's there's the gap between the sort of nice, I think admirable aspirations and even strategic aspirations, and some of the dangers in execution. Anyway, maybe we should move to student questions, and a risk of me just talking the whole time. Student and other audience members. I see a. Do you want to take them? Okay, sure, right there.
Hi, thank you for being here. I am, as student, haven't taken Antitrust. I'm just trying to understand, because in your talk you mentioned WeWork and FTX, which intuitively are not monopoly, but they are suggesting they should be covered by antitrust enforcement. And are you saying that it's because they use competitive predatory pricing that they should?
So I don't think FTX was an antitrust question. I was more talking about a general trend in business. WeWork I think it was engaged in attempted monopolization, failed. There were a bunch of office sharing companies in the early 2000 teens. WeWork was one of them, and WeWork's model was just to get a ton of money from venture capitalists and underprice everyone to try to roll up the market. As it turns out, you can't monopolize that market, or he wasn't able to. But certainly if predatory pricing law had been vibrant, I don't think that anybody would try that model.
Thank you.
Classic SoftBank business model, by the way. No, I'm serious. They're anyway. Why don't we go to another? Can I make a comment on that or an
SoftBank
answer?
funded both Sam Bankman-Fried and Adam Newman. Just, you know.
Yeah, SoftBank. If you trace the record of SoftBank's investments, they're almost always investments in decreasing competition, trying to monopolize a market. It almost. I mean, you shouldn't judge a merger or a funding effort by its funders, but that's like the underlying business, and sometimes it pays off, like the T-Mobile Sprint merger is a good example. They figured that market would eventually go to 4-3. There'd be a big payoff from that, bought Sprint, and that was an example. But there's a lot more, and I think it's worse in other countries. Can I make a comment on that? Like, if it's, which I think is a good question. You asked, well, why are you concerned about these entities if they're not necessarily monopolies or and I guess you could go more straightforwardly and be more of an antitrust lawyer and saying, is it clear they're violating Section 1 of the Sherman Act because there's an agreement or something? And I think there's a tension in the movement a little bit, almost revealed by your opening remarks, as to whether the concerns of the state of the U.S. economy, the anti-monopoly movement, or whether it's things that are, strictly speaking, monopoly or violations of the Sherman Act. And obviously, I think the concern needs to be broader. And not limited to, as if the only thing a business can do wrong is violate Section 1 or Section 2 of the Sherman Act. But you can get kind of drawn into that. And one way I think about this, when I was in government sometimes, when I was thinking about private equity, and our essentially lack of an answer to some of the conduct that is concerning with private equity, sometimes I would say, when people wrote the Sherman Act in the late 1880s, this just seemed natural mergers. When they started naming mergers as a problem, this seemed like, well, what do you mean? Mergers are just what companies do. You might as well. There's a quote from Standard Oil. It's like you might as well try and interfere. Standard Oil's general counsel. You might as well try and interfere with like clouds forming or waterfalls tumbling over a cliff. It's just part of nature. And a big ongoing question is what you assume is just part of the nature of business and what is something that needs to be dealt with in a new way. And often I feel with some of these new challenges, we are, I think some of them are familiar, but some of them really are unfamiliar in a way that we should not be just limited by the fact that we don't have a particularized law to deal with it to call it a problem. Maybe that's my way of putting it. Yeah. Any more questions?
Richard, did you want to say something? Okay.
So I'm also a student here at Columbia and had previously worked in the humanitarian sector. So I'm curious, humanitarian sector is another industry which has a lot of money, goes out of the government and is captured by connected players in the US before it reaches target locations. Whether there's a issue set or agency of government that you think is particularly good at allocating money to its stated issue with less of that capture.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. I don't know. I know one of the guys at USAID that is working on competition policy. I think a lot of our foreign aid goes out, and people in government have tended to think, well, if we want to help other countries structure digital markets or whatever it is, or we want to help with agriculture, let's bring in Facebook or let's bring in Cargill or whatever. Like our dominant monopolies, because in many ways they have the infrastructure, they have the knowledge. Our government officials rely on them for sort of quasi-sovereign purposes and responsibilities. And they don't tend to think about market structure in other countries as something that you would want to decentralize. They just haven't thought about it. And that's changing. But it's just starting to change, I think. I think the competition order that that Tim wrote has had a catalytic effect all over government. And now this is, do you guys, so he wrote a competition executive order that said all areas of government have to focus on competition. And what this does to any bureaucrat is they can just hold up the executive order and they could say, this is the thing that we need to be doing. So I think that's had an impact. I don't know how the government spends money abroad. I can't really keep track of what's going on here. So that it's hard to, yeah. But you should figure that out. I'm not kidding. There's so many there's so many problems. It's so exciting.
Professor John is.
Do you want to do a?
Mike, yeah.
This is, where are you? Are you in history or in journalism?
History and journalism.
History and journalism.
Yeah.
This is Richard, who is referred to in the remark, Professor Richard John. Yeah.
I'll put on my historian hat and my concerned citizen hat. And this is in response, Tim, to something you said. Sherman Act had a competitiveness and a competition dimension. The competitiveness dimension was the Republicans were in big trouble. They had a huge billion-dollar Congress, and the tariff was at an extraordinarily high level. So in effect, we want to promote U.S. industry. Sherman's meeting constituents who were worried about this, and he'd been an anti-monopolist since the 1860s when he promoted the National Telegraph Act, the first major piece of anti-monopoly legislation, the federal government. And his idea was explicitly to oppose predatory pricing by big companies within the United States that would beat up on little companies in the United States because we had this huge tariff. Now, you may say that's a Rube Goldberg design, but it had an international competitiveness dimension because we don't want American workers to have terrible, we don't want to race to the bottom, so American workers are as badly off as the workers were in Dickensian England. So that's my historian hat. But my concerned citizen hat is, I share your concerns about capitalism. I've read Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. We now have an explicit defense of monopoly coming out of venture capitalists, coming out of Stanford Business School, half the Stanford undergraduates. This problem may be a bigger one than just bad apples. We've not in our past embraced monopoly the way, and I'll use the word, libertarians like Peter Thiel are. So there's a principled defense of monopoly today that as a historian strikes me as new, unsettling, and potentially very dangerous. I don't know if you want to respond to Thiel or, yeah.
Oh, I don't need any more problems. I have the. So I'll put on my little brother hat to annoy. So when I want to annoy the left, which is every other Tuesday, I'll tweet something like, "The natural egalitarian impulse in America is anti-monopolism, not really socialism," which is a little bit of an exaggeration, but gets the job done. The point is to prod and to say that they come from the same place. The desire for equality, one way to say it is we need to tax the wealthy and redistribute it. A different way of saying don't let one guy have a toll booth over the economy. But there's also a political element to it, which is you can talk to any. I've become friendly with a lot of conservatives at this point, which was very weird for me because I thought Republicans were, I was very partisan. And they all read my book, they read a lot of my stuff, and they were like, this is great. We're all into this anti-monopoly stuff. And then, there are differences that remain. But it was really interesting to have that conversation. Then I talked to a lot of people in business, and they really believe in the ability to conduct business in a fair manner, in a sort of an intuitive. It really is baked into the American DNA, this hatred of monopolies. Really is our natural egalitarian tradition. You can talk, if you say, should we tax the rich and redistribute it, maybe you'll get 60% in the poll, and then you can muddy that up. But when we do polls, when we do focus groups on monopolies, everybody hates them. And the people that hate them the most are old Republican men. They just hate them. And it's really interesting to see it. It is this intuitive thing that we have in America. And I don't think the libertarians are it's so easy to confuse them. right? And that's, I think, why we've been so successful, because we come at them from a pro-business standpoint and are like, look, there is a difference between a farmer's market and a derivatives market. There just is. And there's a difference between a market that has anti-fraud statutes and one that doesn't. And if you say that is not business, that's cheating, people will be like, yeah. If you say, we need to regulate that, people are going to be like, I don't know. Because we don't need to regulate that. That is cheating. That shouldn't exist. I remember talking to this pollster. We had this big, it was very annoying, Democratic pollsters. The younger ones are better. It's really great. This Democratic pollster did this whole, he was paid a lot of money to do a poll about monopoly. And the question he put up was, should we do nothing about monopoly or should we regulate monopoly? And he had all of these like, I don't know, people are like, kind of want to regulate it, but they kind of, and I was like, have you thought about like, I don't know, breaking them up? And he was like, oh, yeah, that's a really good idea. I wish we had thought about that before we spent our $50,000 or whatever it was. And it's like, that's why I think you have these people coming out of Stanford, is because they've never faced a real attack on that ideology. And when they face an attack on that ideology, they crumple. I mean, it's ugly. Like they lose instantly. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons you don't see the Republicans are split on this. The Democrats are split and the Republicans are split. But the monopolists are attacking us, but they're attacking us from laterally. Like nobody went after Lena Khan for banning non-competes. They went after her for procedural nonsense because they can't win on the merits. And even the ones who were like, well, non-competes are probably, they have some useful, well, of course, non-competes for low-wage workers are bad. Like they can't win on the substance. And that's because that DNA really is there and it really does exist. And they just have to hide it. As long as no one runs on it, then we can lose. But when somebody figures out how to run on this stuff, whoever figures it out and actually executes is going to run this country for 40 years.
I guess I'll just go ahead. Question in the front.
Yeah, thanks again for being here. Just a quick question on agriculture and the agricultural industry. What are your policy proposals to kind of break up that space?
Me or that? It's a big question. I have to make myself not talk as a White House official and try to talk like normal. There's this law, which you may be familiar or not familiar with, the Packers and Stockyards Act, which is primarily focused on meat. But it sort of sets a model for the way you need to think in agriculture, which is there needs to be a lot, that thinking just about the consumers, and the prices has been and maybe this is like 102, 101 for you, but it's like a failed policy. And you need to do reform that protects producers and operates at the problem of power in the middle of the industry. What exactly that means depends. Whether you have the will to do it depends. But I think that is the missing piece is the concern with buyer power at the core. Because I think much of the country, and farmers are, I talk about determined anti-monopoly activists. It's not, regardless of partisanship, just spend any time in agriculture. But the thing they're concerned about is not prices being high. It's about them being overpowered at the core, at the center. I don't know if you want to add to it.
Yeah, I think you start with price discrimination and supermarkets, because they're the ones that are putting pressure on the whole supply chain. And so you shouldn't allow Walmart to kill its rivals by just bargaining for better prices. So this is the Robinson-Patman Act, which the FTC is reviving. But in Packers and Stockyards, you can use unfairness to address price discrimination. So I think the key really is the buyer power piece. You have buyer powers at every level of the industry, and you have to break those up. And I think the other part is, I would say, we need to reestablish markets, and that means a lot of the contracting is, and this is actually true everywhere. This is true for airlines, Ticketmaster, pharmaceuticals. There are no prices. You can't find out what the prices are for anything because they're all kept secret and they're all personalized and I think one of the things that cattle ranchers want is they just want cash markets again. And instead of what they have now, which are, like kind of you sign a deal with a packer and then there's no like the price is referenced to cash markets, which are actually so thin at this point that they're easily manipulable. We need a return to cash. There's some legislation in Congress to return to those cash markets, but just try finding out the price of insulin. This is not agriculture, but like one of the nice things about monopolies, like there are really a limited number of scams and they just reuse them across industries. This is kind of the point of McKinsey. Yeah. But, buyer power is the reason we have huge problems in agriculture. It's also the reason we have shortages in pharmaceuticals. It's also the reason we have food deserts. Like price discrimination, opacity of markets, all comes back to buyer power. It's Standard Oil, buyer power, right? Again, they're not new, right? I love when they talk about how billionaires are brilliant. It's like you're just doing the same thing.
Let's see if we can get a few more. I noticed there's more hands up there. Yeah.
This goes back to two of your comments. One was what you ended with by saying that, this is not a debate between whether we are pro-business or anti-business, but it's about how do we do that business. But the debate is also somewhat about whether we are okay with like an obnoxious concentration of wealth or if we aren't. And in that context, this ties back to another comment of yours where you said that the left progressives have through the 70s, 80s and 90s had somewhat missed what was happening in terms of the reforms. So do you think that this missing was somewhat a product of the overall anti-Marxist, anti-communist sentiment through this country through the Cold War, which was also sort of around the same time? And in that context, do you think that because people were uncomfortable challenging the concentration of wealth through the time because of the anti-Marxist sentiment, this also led to concentration of wealth like never before?
So I actually think that a lot of the arguments from both the left and neoliberals are Marxist. So I actually think that it's the Marxism is at the root. I mean, this is sort of, I don't know that much about Marx, so I don't want to be, I'm probably going to offend some people. I don't mean to do that. But the idea of inevitabilism, right? Technology and globalization, right? What I found when I was researching, John Kenneth Galbraith is they believed in these giant titanic forces, and so do like the neoliberals, right? Which is why the people at USTR, the Trade Reps Office, they just think, oh, well, these agreements are inevitable, globalization's inevitable, technologies. This is all Marx, right? It's the anti-monopolists who don't believe in that and who actually think that this stuff is structured by policy. And so when I'm looking at the problem that we're facing, I actually, what got me interested in anti-monopoly policy is that it's not that there's a story that Reagan, I keep rewinding, sorry, in my head. You're not in here, so you don't see that, but I am. Reagan, there's this argument from a lot of people that Reagan got rid of antitrust. And so we can blame the conservatives, those mean people at the University of Chicago. It's not our fault. The question that I have is, why didn't the Democrats fight back? And the more closely you look at it, the more the Democrats were like, yeah, this is a good idea. And then you look at the people who were on the left, and they didn't fight back either. It's not, the Marxists weren't like saying, we need to bring back anti-monopoly rules. Today, they're not saying that. The Marxists were like, we like consolidation. We just wish we were the ones who were in charge. And so the question is, why didn't the left fight back? Why didn't Democrats fight back? And that, I think, is a harder question emotionally and psychologically if you're a left-winger, because then you have to start taking some responsibility for what happened, right? If your tradition did it. And so I think that tradition, like in America, the tradition of anti-monopolism, I think is core to all aspects of our right, left, center. And the left got rid of it. I mean, there was a fight, and the left got rid of its anti-monopoly tradition and embraced a kind of more quasi-Marxist tradition, the radical historians from the 50s and 60s, that built the argument that, the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, these were all kind of like a conservative, the victory of conservatives in America, or the victory of a sort of statist approach. Like that argument won. And that's why in the 70s and 80s, when we got rid of antitrust, a lot of leftists didn't notice because they were like, yeah, but it's all controlled by corporations anyway. And it was like, well, no, it wasn't.
Can
and
I
that's
add-
kind of
go ahead.
where I come at it from.
No, I hear that. And can I add something to that? I know, I think that the 20th century's major ideological, understood to be major ideological battle between capitalism and communism, and the fact that that was so pitched, they were so opposite, obscured the fact that they were both, in their pure forms, economic centralization philosophies, and believed in an end result on the one hand, or allowed to have an end result, which was the domination either by monopolies, which are mini dictatorships, or by dictatorship of the proletariat. But both of them moved towards total economic centralization. And the axis that got lost was the axis as between a more centralized and decentralized economy. And that discussion kind of disappeared. And as you said, then in the 80s when that kind of left, people were not paying attention to that kind of argument. So it's hard to see when in the ideology battles of your time what's not being discussed. And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, but the New Dealers were explicit about it. So Robert Jackson, who resurrected the Antitrust Division before Thurman Arnold, said what the capitalist seeks because of his greed, the socialist seeks because of his creed.
Yeah. Maybe we have time we said we'd go to 110, so maybe one last question. I'll try and stop from jumping in on things. Yes.
Hi, I was just curious if there's any way to rein in the monopolistic tendencies of enterprises that operate off loss leading. So all the big tech companies, is there any way to reform that so we capture the innovation without giving in to this monopoly?
So we're going to answer that, but Richard, I think you wanted to say something. I think you can do it by bringing antitrust cases and trying to resurrect predatory pricing law through the courts. And you can say, well, the framework that the Supreme Court used is clearly not operable. I think the argument from a number of scholars was predatory pricing is rare and irrational. And if you can just show that's not true, then you can challenge it in the courts and keep throwing cases at the courts. You can also change it through statute at a state level and at a federal level, and there is interest on both levels to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I have. It's a big topic, and some of these questions are huge questions. But I think it also has a lot to do with making sure that the core needed platform assets necessary to start businesses or be successful are not privately owned and privately controlled. HTML, there's a big difference between HTML, which is just kind of out there, and trying to be successful on Amazon, for example. That's a fundamental difference, and there's efforts to try to restore that, but I think that is a big part of the picture in tech. It's a huge topic, but I'll just add, we are not in a particularly innovative space in tech anymore. People sort of assume this tech industry is innovative, but has Facebook actually changed anything in 7 years other than tinkering? Google search has not obviously gotten better. There's areas that are kind of innovative, that tend to be sort of big laboratory areas like AI, but the kind of small scale innovation that was big in this country in the 70s, big in this country in earlier parts like the turn of the 20th, 19th century, that seems to be down right now. So anyway, it's a huge topic. I think that's all the time we have. So thanks everyone for coming, and let's thank our speaker, Matt. Thanks again for coming up, Matt.
Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Yeah. It's tough. Some of this.
I have a train at 3, so I have some time.
Okay, I'll come for a minute. I did have to go see my wife at some point.
All right. I don't necessarily think that's
Do you still stand by your sort of like creative monopoly argument?
Yeah, with